Hello and welcome to another episode of Music Goats. I'm DJ Ray and I'd like to invite you to join me regularly for my new mini podcasts featuring some of the greatest of all time in various music categories. So without further ado, the spotlight this week shines toward the greatest black artists of all time. Of course, February is Black History Month and I didn't want to pass up the chance to use this episode as a tribute. Just before I get to this week's show, I'd like to remind you that the perspective you're about to hear is mostly based on my personal opinion. That said, I make an effort to back up my opinion with some facts. I don't claim to know everything about music, and a lot of what you're about to hear is simply based on my past experience as a DJ. That said, let's dive into our latest episode. As you might know, the month of February has been dedicated to the celebration of Black history for many years now. This mini podcast focuses specifically on the music side of things and how it has been shaped by the Black community. As far back as I can remember, Black artists have been very involved in contributing to the development of music. Almost a century ago, jazz artists like Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, and Billie Holiday were dazzling the world with their unique style and soulful vocals. And who can forget Chuck Berry in the 1950s, who gave us a style of rock and roll that has never been seen before. The way he played that guitar left his audience in awe. Then there's Little Richard, who had the energy of three men when he performed his eclectic style while pounding his piano. As we moved into the 1960s, Black artists started to establish more of a mainstream vibe with trailblazers like Ray Charles, who electrified us with his effortless piano skills and soulful vocals. Other major Black artists who emerged during the 1960s include icons like James Brown, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, and Diana Ross, who was a centerpiece in the development of a new sound that was surfacing called Motown. Black artists like Jimi Hendrix were even proven that they could expand beyond R&B and soul. Now don't get me wrong, Jimi Hendrix had loads of soul, but he expressed it in a way that even Chuck Berry didn't do. His guitar seemed to be directly connected to his heart, and he gave us a different psychedelic style rock sound that had never been heard before his time. By the 1970s, Black music began to explode, especially in North America, with legendary artists like Michael Jackson, who was born into music royalty and was able to influence every decade forward, right up until his untimely death in 2009. The sound that truly defined the 1970s was undoubtedly the funk and disco movement that was driven by Black artists like Earth, Wind & Fire, Donna Summer, and Gloria Gaynor, to name a few. Other honorable mentions from the 1970s include Barry White, Al Green, and of course, Bob Marley, who basically introduced reggae music to North America. During the 1980s, Michael Jackson truly began to establish himself as a powerful solo artist, no longer relying on his brothers in the Jackson 5. Of course, who can mention Michael Jackson without bringing up his counterpart, the artist formerly known as Prince? This upstart from Minnesota took the world by storm, combining his incredible guitar skills with his unique and spine-chilling vocals. And then there's the legendary Tina Turner, who was huge in the 1970s, but seemed to rise to another level in the 80s, breaking away from her estranged husband Ike Turner and blossoming into one of the greatest solo acts of all time. Entering the 1980s, other Black artists like Lionel Richie were also spreading their wings, moving away from his roots with the Commodores and beginning one of the greatest solo careers in music history. Another solo career that was starting to take off was that of funk great Rick James, whose high-energy style electrified his fans. And speaking of incredible careers, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the late Whitney Houston, who took the world by storm with her powerful vocals that hadn't been heard since divas like Diana Ross and Aretha Franklin. By the late 1980s, a relatively new genre called hip-hop was really starting to grow. Pioneers like Run DMC and LL Cool J were laying down the groundwork for future 90s rap stars like Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, Tupac, Puff Daddy, and Biggie Smalls. As we transitioned to the 90s, Black music had become the staple of a sound heard around the world, and both hip-hop and R&B were setting the tone for an even bigger explosion about to come in the new millennium. During the early 2000s, Black artists were laying claim to the music industry with singers like Beyoncé, Usher, Alicia Keys, Nelly, Mary J. Blige, Jay-Z, Rihanna, 50 Cent, and Kanye West. Hip-hop music had become the top genre in America, and it still remains as one of the most popular to this very day. As the millennium matured and we approached the 2010s, other influential black artists like Nicki Minaj and Drake began to emerge. By this point, it was clear that hip-hop was here to stay. Although there's still many more artists that contributed to the development of black music, and it's difficult to mention them all, I'd like to leave you with several honorable mentions, including Jackie Wilson, Roberta Flack, Chaka Khan, Janet Jackson, Neo, and even Darius Rucker, who took a completely different path than most of his counterparts by splitting his career between rock music and evolving into a renowned country star. Now, before I wrap things up, I'd like to offer up my personal top 3 black artists of all time, with the number 3 spot going to Usher, number 2 has to be given to Prince, and my number 1 favorite black artist of all time is reserved for the iconic Stevie Wonder. Well, that does it for this episode of Music Goats featuring the greatest black performers of all time. I'm DJ Ray, and I look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Music Goats.